Somewhere between the deep blue and the dreaming mind, she waits, half woman, half sea, entirely impossible. And yet, for thousands of years, humanity could not stop believing in her, could not stop drawing her, singing about her, fearing her, longing for her. She has appeared in the oldest written records we possess. She has been carved into stone temples, painted onto the hulls of ships, woven into the mythology of civilizations that never once met each other. From the icy fjords of Norway to the warm, lantern-lit harbors of ancient Babylon, from the coral-ringed islands of Polynesia to the landlocked villages of landlocked peoples who had never even seen the ocean, and still, somehow, knew her name. She is the mermaid, and she is far stranger, far older, and far more complicated than the golden-haired, shell-adorned figure the modern world has made her out to be. Let us begin not with beauty, we will get to beauty, but with something more primal than that. Let us begin with the sea itself, because that is where she was born. Long before the first human being put brush to cave wall, the ocean was already the great unknown. It surrounded civilization the way darkness surrounds a campfire. It gave food, and it took lives, and it gave no explanations for either. Ancient peoples did not see the sea as empty. They could not afford to, and so they filled it, as all human beings fill the things they fear, with stories, with meaning, with creatures. The mermaid was the sea given a face. She was the answer to the question no sailor could ever quite stop asking, what is down there? And for that reason, she was not always beautiful. That is perhaps the first great misconception. Modern culture has handed us about these creatures. Strip away the Disney palette, the red hair and the sparkling tail, and what you find beneath is something far more ancient and far more ambiguous. The earliest mermaids were not gentle. They were not singing about longing for a world above the waves. They were warnings. They were the sea's own voice, given lips. And the sea, as any sailor will tell you, does not comfort. It tests. The very first mermaid we know of by name appears nearly 4,000 years ago in ancient Assyria. Her name was a Targetis, and she was a goddess. A great goddess, worshipped across the ancient Near East. Her story, as recorded by the Greeks who encountered her cult, is one of grief and transformation. She loved a mortal man, and when he died, consumed with sorrow, she threw herself into a lake, intending to become a fish. But the water, it seems, could only change her so far. Her beauty was too powerful, too insistent, for the depths to wholly swallow. And so she emerged, half woman above, half fish below, a creature neither fully of the world above nor the one below. She was, from the very beginning, a creature of thresholds, of the in-between. That liminal quality, that sense of existing between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, would define the mermaid for millennia. And it is why she endured, because the mermaid was never just a fantasy. She was a mirror. Every culture that conjured her was really describing something about themselves, their fears about the sea, their longing for the untamable, their deep and aching suspicion that the world held more mystery than they could safely account for. She was beautiful because beauty is the most disarming kind of danger. She was dangerous because the sea is dangerous, and she was the sea. And she was melancholy, almost always in the old stories, melancholy, because she represented a kind of impossible desire, something wanted but never quite reached, a world glimpsed but never entered. She sang in many of the old traditions, and that song was the most perilous thing about her. Not her tail, not her teeth, in the versions that gave her teeth. The song, because the song made you forget yourself. It made you lean forward over the railing of your ship, straining to hear just a little more clearly, just a little more. And that was all it took. In the segments ahead, we will travel through the full extraordinary history of this creature. We will visit the ancient worlds that first dreamed her into being. We will sail alongside the mariners who swore they saw her with their own eyes. We will ask what science has found in the deep. What strange, half-glimpsed animals of the real ocean may have first planted her image in a tired sailor's mind. We will examine the darker currents of her myth. The mermaids who drowned men, the ones who granted wishes, the ones who wept on rocks for loves they could never hold. And yes, we will ask the question you have perhaps already been quietly turning over. Were they real? Stay with us. The water is calm tonight, and the story is just beginning. Close your eyes for a moment and try to imagine the Mediterranean Sea, not as it is today, dotted with ferry routes and pleasure craft, and the soft glow of coastal cities, but as it was 3,000 years ago, a vast, wind-governed wilderness of blue and green, stretching further than any map could honestly describe. A place where the horizon was not a destination, but a warning, where ships were made of wood and rope and human courage, and the open water cared nothing for any of those things. Now imagine being a sailor on such a sea. Weeks from shore, the stars your only navigation, the wind your only engine, and beneath the hull of your small wooden vessel, fathoms of black, lightless water, reaching down to depths no human being had ever seen, or ever would. What lived down there? You did not know. You could not know. And in that not knowing, something took shape. Something had to. This is where the mermaid was born. Not in imagination alone, but in the very specific anxiety of a world that understood the sea's power and could not explain it. And the civilizations that first gave her form were among the most sophisticated the ancient world had ever produced. We return, first, to Atargates, because she deserves more than a passing introduction. Atargates was worshipped in the city of Hierapolis, in what is now modern Syria, as early as the 9th century before the Common Era. She was not a minor deity. She was among the most important goddesses of the ancient Near East, a figure of fertility, of water, of divine feminine power, and her temples were attended by priests and pilgrims from across the known world. The Greek historian Lucian of Samosata, writing in the 2nd century, described her sanctuary at Hierapolis in considerable detail. He noted the sacred fish pools that surrounded her temple, fish so holy that no one was permitted to touch them. The connection between this goddess and the water was total, absolute, and the image that represented her, half woman and half fish, was not seen as monstrous. It was seen as divine. That is worth pausing on, because in the modern imagination, the idea of a creature that is part human and part animal tends to carry either a fairy tale sweetness or a horror movie unease. But in the ancient world, hybrid creatures were not aberrations. They were amplifications. They represented the meeting point of two powers, two natures, two worlds. Atargates was not a woman who had tragically lost her legs. She was a being who contained within herself both the human world and the aquatic one. She was greater for it, not lesser. She was worshipped precisely because she could move between those worlds in ways no ordinary creature could. This idea, the mermaid as a figure of divine power rather than tragic enchantment, is one that will keep resurfacing as we move through history. But it is a meaning that has been quietly eroded over the centuries, smoothed away like sea glass, until what we are left with is something softer and more domesticated. Something that fits more easily into a children's story. The original was considerably more formidable. From Babylon and ancient Syria, the legend moved, as legends do, flowing along trade routes and coastlines, into the world of ancient Greece. The Greeks, as any student of mythology knows, had an extraordinarily complex relationship with the sea. They were a maritime civilization, dependent on ocean trade, and they populated their waters with a remarkable diversity of supernatural beings. There were the Nereids, The 50 daughters of the sea god Nereus, depicted as beautiful women from the waist up, though not always explicitly fish-tailed, who rode dolphins and calmed storms. There was Thetis, mother of Achilles, herself a Nereid, whose power over the sea was intimate and personal. There were the Tritons, male counterparts to the Mermaids, conch-blowing messengers of Poseidon, who blurred the boundary between man and fish in precisely the same way. But the Greek figure most people reach for when they think of dangerous women and the sea is not, strictly speaking, a mermaid at all. The sirens, those lethal, irresistible singers of the Odyssey, are today almost universally imagined as fish-tailed women. In Homer's original telling, they were nothing of the sort. They were birds. Bird women, winged creatures who perched on rocky outcroppings and sang passing ships to their destruction. It was only later, in the gradual evolution of classical imagery, that the siren and the mermaid began to merge, that the wings became fins, the rocky cliff became the ocean surface, and the dangerous music became the sound of the sea itself. This merging is telling. It suggests that by the later classical period, the mermaid had become the dominant image for a very specific kind of danger, beautiful, aquatic, and irresistible. The siren's wings were traded for a tail because the tail made more sense to a culture in which the sea, not the sky, was the primary theater of mystery and peril. The song remained. The song always remained. Further east, and considerably earlier, the mythology of ancient Babylon gave the world one of the most fascinating mermaid. Adjacent figures in recorded history, a being not female at all, but male. His name was Oannes, and the account of him, preserved by the Babylonian priest Berossus in the 3rd century before the Common Era, is one of the most quietly astonishing documents in the history of ancient mythology. Oannes, according to Berossus, emerged from the waters of the Persian Gulf at the very beginning of human civilization. He was, by description, a creature with the body of a fish, but with a human head growing beneath the fish's head, and human feet beneath the fish's tail. He came ashore each day with the rising sun, spent the daylight hours among human beings, teaching them agriculture, teaching them letters, teaching them law and art and architecture, giving them, in essence, the entire infrastructure of civilized life. And then, each evening, he returned to the sea. He ate nothing among human beings. He needed nothing from them. He gave and gave and gave, and then disappeared beneath the waves until morning. What is extraordinary about Oannes is what his story reveals about the ancient understanding of where wisdom came from. Not from the mountains, not from the sky, from the deep water, from the inaccessible, from the unknown, from the place human beings could not follow. The sea was not merely terrifying to the ancient Babylonians. It was the source, the origin, and the being who carried that origin's knowledge up into the human world was a figure of the threshold, exactly as Atargates was, belonging to two worlds, serving as a bridge between them. The mermaid, or merman, as the case may be, was, in her earliest forms, not a creature of romance. She was a creature of profound cosmic significance. We must also sail, in our imagination, to ancient India. The Sanskrit epic Ramayana, composed somewhere between the 5th and 1st centuries before the Common Era, contains within its vast narrative a figure called Suvarnamacha, the golden fish, a mermaid princess who attempts to thwart the hero Rama's construction of a bridge to Lanka by commanding fish to steal away the stones his army of monkey warriors had set in place. She fails, eventually, but she falls in love with Hanuman in the process, and their story is one of the earliest and most tenderly written interspecies romances in world literature. What is remarkable about Suvarnamacha is not only her age, she predates the Little Mermaid by roughly 2,000 years, but her character. She is neither a passive enchantress nor a mindless predator. She is a strategist, She has a plan, an agenda, and a political motivation. She exists within a fully realized world of her own beneath the sea, with her own loyalties and her own sense of duty. And when she falls in love, she does not dissolve into that love. She remains, throughout, her own person. This is a version of the mermaid that history has not always preserved with full fidelity. And then there is the oldest mermaid story that may be the oldest of them all. So old that some scholars trace its roots back to before written language. Across the Pacific Islands, across the coastal cultures of sub-Saharan Africa, across the indigenous traditions of the Americas, there appear, independently, again and again, stories of beings who live in the water and take human form at the shore. The specifics vary enormously. The spirit can be male or female, benevolent or dangerous, a bringer of rain or a cause of drowning. But the underlying architecture of the story is consistent across cultures that could not possibly have borrowed from one another. That consistency is, in itself, a kind of evidence. Not evidence of the mermaid's existence, perhaps, but evidence of something else, something equally compelling. Evidence that the impulse to imagine a human presence in the water is not a cultural accident. It is something that emerges, reliably, from the human mind when confronted with the mystery of the deep. We are pattern-seeking creatures. We see faces in clouds and figures in the grain of wood. When we look at the ocean, that vast, dark, breathing thing, we do not see emptiness. We see depth. We see concealment. We see the strong, unsettling feeling that something, somewhere beneath the surface, might be looking back. And we have, throughout all of recorded history, given that feeling a name. She has a tail where her legs should be. Her hair moves like kelp in still water. And if you are very quiet, if the night is calm and the sea is flat, and you have been long enough at the edge of things, you might just hear her singing. She has been singing for 4,000 years. She is only just getting started. There is something that happens to a man at sea for a very long time. It is not madness, not exactly. It is something quieter than madness, and in some ways more interesting. The mind, deprived of the familiar textures of land, the smell of soil, the sound of wind in trees, the sight of a face that recognizes you, begins to reach. It reaches for meaning in the patterns of wave and cloud. It reaches for companionship in the cries of seabirds. It softens, slowly, at its edges, the way a photograph left in sunlight slowly loses its sharpness. And in that softened, reaching state, the boundary between what is seen and what is imagined becomes, not dissolved exactly, but permeable. This is not a weakness. It is a very human response to an inhuman environment. And it is, in part, why the golden age of maritime exploration, that long, extraordinary period between roughly the 13th and 18th centuries, when European ships pressed outward into every ocean on Earth, produced more mermaid sightings than any other era in human history. Men who were exhausted, sun-scorched, half-starved, and months from anything they recognized as home, looked out over the moving water and saw things. Or believed they did. And then they wrote those things down. In ship's logs, in letters home, in the journals that have survived, through extraordinary luck and institutional care. Into the present day, these are not the accounts of fools. They are the accounts of navigators. Let us begin with the most famous of them all, and perhaps the most surprising. On the 9th of January, 1493, Christopher Columbus was sailing along the coast of what is now the Dominican Republic when he recorded in his journal, with characteristic directness, that he had seen 3 mermaids rise from the sea. He was not, by his own account, terribly impressed. He noted that they were not as beautiful as they had been painted. They had, he wrote, something of the face of a man about them. This observation, so prosaic, so oddly disappointed, is one of the most illuminating details in the entire history of mermaid sightings. Columbus had crossed an ocean. He had navigated by stars through storms. He had done things that most of the people alive in his time would have considered literally impossible. And when he saw what he believed to be mermaids, his reaction was not wonder. It was mild, critical assessment. He had expected beauty, the beauty of the paintings, the illuminated manuscripts, the decorative tradition, and what he found instead was something else, something more animal, something that looked at him with a face that was almost, but not quite, human. What Columbus almost certainly saw were manatees, West Indian manatees to be precise, large, slow, gentle marine mammals that inhabit the shallow coastal waters of the Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico. They surface regularly to breathe. When seen from a distance, or from a certain angle, or by eyes that have been staring at open water for weeks and are primed to find human shapes in the waves, they can, in apparently entirely sincere ways, suggest the outline of a human figure in the water. The females, notably, nurse their young cradled against their chests, in a posture that strikes observers, at some distance and in some light, as disturbingly maternal. Columbus was not the last experienced sailor to make this mistake. He was not even close to the last. But his account is valuable precisely because of that note of disappointment. He had expected something beautiful. He had, in other words, already been shaped by a cultural tradition that told him mermaids were beautiful. And the real ocean, in its usual fashion, declined to cooperate with the tradition. Henry Hudson, the great English explorer whose name now graces a bay, a river, and a strait in the far north of the American continent, kept a log of careful, empirical observations throughout his voyages. He was not a man given to fancy. And yet, in June of 1625, members of his crew recorded what they stated plainly was a mermaid sighting off the coast of the Russian Arctic. Two of his sailors, coming up on deck separately, reported the same thing. A creature swimming alongside the ship, a woman's body from the navel upward, her skin very white, her long black hair hanging down her back. Below the waist, the tail of a porpoise, they said, speckled like a mackerel. The detail is striking, not vague and impressionistic, the way a hallucination or a wish tends to be, but specific in the way that real observation tends to be. The speckled tail, the white skin against dark hair, two witnesses separately, describing the same thing. Hudson's log does not editorialize. It simply records. Here is what the men said they saw. Make of it what you will. What they most likely saw, in those cold northern waters, was a harp seal, or possibly a beluga whale, observed through the particular distorting lens of exhaustion and expectation. The Arctic has a quality of light in the summer months, a flat, diffuse, almost hallucinatory brightness that plays extraordinary tricks with perception at sea. Distances compress and expand. Shapes shimmer at their edges. It is not a forgiving environment for the precise calibration of the human eye. But here is the thing that the simple explanation of manatees and seals and tired eyes does not fully account for. The consistency. The extraordinary, cross-cultural, centuries-long consistency of what these sailors described. Not merely a human-shaped thing in the water, but specifically a woman, specifically long-haired, specifically watching them. There is something in the architecture of the sighting that goes beyond the misidentification of a particular marine mammal and reaches into something deeper about what the human mind is doing when it looks at the ocean and reaches for a face. The medieval church, for its part, had a very particular problem with the mermaid. It was not that the church disbelieved in her precisely. The natural world of the medieval imagination was vastly more populated with strange and supernatural creatures than our own, and the mermaid was simply one item in a long bestiary that included also the unicorn, the basilisk, the griffin, and the bonacon, a beast said to defend itself by projecting its own flaming excrement at pursuers, which is perhaps a subject for a different documentary. Mermaids appeared in medieval bestiaries those illustrated encyclopedias of real and imagined animals, alongside wholly genuine creatures, treated with identical seriousness, given their own entries, their own moral interpretations, their own theological significance. And that was precisely the problem. If the mermaid existed, and many learned people of the medieval period were entirely willing to accept that she did, then the church faced a question that was, in its own way, as vast and unanswerable as the ocean itself. Did she have a soul? This was not an idle question. It was a question with profound theological stakes. The soul, in medieval Christian thought, was the thing that separated human beings from the rest of creation. It was what made a person in the eyes of God, what determined their capacity for salvation, what placed them on one side or the other of the most important boundary in the universe. And here was this creature, half human, half fish, straddling that boundary with her entire body. If the human half of her had a soul, what about the fish half? Could half a soul be saved? Could a being that returned to the sea, that cold, pre-Christian pagan wilderness, at the end of the day be a creature of God at all? Medieval theologians wrote about this with absolute earnestness. Saint Augustine, in The City of God, had already grappled with the question of monstrous races, half-human creatures reported from the edges of the known world, and had concluded that if they were real and descended from Adam, then they must share in the human capacity for redemption. Later thinkers applied this framework to the mermaid specifically. Some concluded she was soulless, a creature of the flesh and the sea, incapable of grace, a symbol of carnal temptation to be avoided. Others argued that her human portion indicated human origin and therefore human spiritual status. The debate was, in a way, the most serious philosophical attention the mermaid has ever received, and it produced a body of literature, sermons, treatises, marginalia in illuminated manuscripts that reveals just how genuinely uncertain the medieval mind was about where the human ended and the natural world began. It was also in this period that the mermaid's symbolism began its long, complex, morally loaded evolution. In the churches of medieval Europe, and this may surprise you, mermaids appeared everywhere. They were carved into the misericords of cathedral choir stalls, painted into the borders of psalters, worked into the stonework of baptismal fonts, not as decorations exactly, and certainly not as celebrations. They were cautionary figures. The mermaid holding a mirror was the sin of vanity. The mermaid holding a comb was sensual temptation. The mermaid with two tails, spread symmetrically on either side, a figure that appears with startling frequency in Romanesque art, and whose origins trace back to ancient Near Eastern goddess imagery, was the duality of nature, the dangerous fertility of the untamed earth. She was, in the language of medieval symbolism, the seduction of the world. Beautiful, yes, but the beauty of something that would pull you under. Beauty as a form of gravity. Beauty as a current you did not feel until it was already carrying you somewhere you had not intended to go. And the sailors who reported seeing her, out on the open water, away from the stone carvings and the illuminated pages, they brought something different back with them. They brought something that the church symbolism did not quite contain. They brought the unsettling possibility that the beauty and the danger were not metaphors at all. That out there, beyond the last headland, past the edge of everything familiar, something real was watching the ships go by. Something with long, dark hair and eyes that held the color of the sea. Something that did not look away. We have been, until now, in relatively gentle waters. We have traced the mermaid through the temples of ancient Babylon, through the wine-dark seas of Greek mythology, through the creaking logbooks of exhausted navigators, squinting at the Arctic horizon. We have watched her move through cathedral stonework and theological debate, and throughout all of it, there has been a kind of romance to the telling. The sense of something beautiful and mysterious hovering just at the edge of human understanding, never quite close enough to touch. But there is another tradition, older in many ways than the romance. Darker, certainly, and considerably more honest about what the ocean actually does to the people who love it. Because the sea does not only enchant, it takes, and the mermaid, in her oldest and most unvarnished forms, was not a creature who watched sadly from the rocks while ships sailed past. She was the reason the ships did not come back. Let us go to Scotland first, to the cold, grey, island-stippled waters of the Hebrides, where the wind comes off the Atlantic in long, horizontal sheets, and the sea is the colour of old iron for half the year. Here, in the oral tradition of the Scottish and Irish coastal peoples, lives one of the most compelling and least sentimental figures in all of mermaid mythology. She is called the Selkie. The Selkie is not, strictly speaking, a mermaid in the classical sense. She does not have a permanent fishtail. She is something more fluid than that, more ambiguous, more unsettling in her ambiguity. In her natural form, she is a seal, but she can shed her skin, that sleek, grey, ocean-smelling skin, and walk on land as a woman, indistinguishable from any other woman, heartbreakingly beautiful, until the moment she finds her skin again and returns to the sea. And she always returns to the sea. That is not a possibility in the Selkie story. It is an inevitability. No matter how long she has lived on land, no matter how many children she has borne, no matter how much, in some versions of the story, she has come to love the life she has built above the waterline. When she finds her skin, she goes back. The sea calls, and she answers, and the door closes behind her, and the family she leaves on the shore must simply learn to live in the aftermath. The Selkie story is devastating in a way that sneaks up on you. On the surface, it presents itself as a supernatural tale of transformation and loss. But underneath, and this is the quality that has kept it alive through centuries of telling and retelling in the communities that built their lives on the edge of those cold northern seas. Underneath, it is a story about the impossibility of fully possessing another person, about the way that some part of the people we love most remains always inaccessible to us, always belongs to something larger than the life we have built together. The seal's skin is just that inaccessible self made visible, made something you could hold in your hands and hide under the floorboards and still, not truly keep. In many versions of the story, the man who finds a Selkie's skin hides it deliberately, trapping her on land, making a wife of her by theft. She is not rescued, she is captured, and the domestic life that follows, the children, the house, the years of ordinary living, is shadowed always by that fact. There is love in it, genuine love in many tellings, but there is no equity. And when the skin is found, always by accident, always by a child who does not understand what they have stumbled upon, the Selkie does not hesitate. She does not linger. She kisses her children, and she is gone. And the man who built his life on her captivity is left with nothing but the sound of the surf and the slow understanding of what he did. It is not a comfortable story. It was never meant to be. Move southward now, to the rivers and lakes of continental Europe, and the mermaid tradition darkens in a different direction entirely. The German and Scandinavian traditions are full of water spirits, the Nixie, the Neck, the Fossegrim, who inhabit fresh water rather than the sea, who can take human form with perfect, unsettling completeness, and whose relationship with human beings is defined by a kind of predatory hunger that has very little romance in it. The Nixie, in her female form, was typically described as a young woman of extraordinary beauty, encountered near rivers or mill ponds, often washing her hair or simply sitting at the water's edge with the particular composure of something that has nowhere else to be and nothing to fear. She would speak to travelers. She would invite them closer, and then she would take them into the water, and they would not come back up. What is striking about the Nixie tradition is its absolute matter-of-factness. There is no seduction in the romantic sense, no falling in love, no bargaining, no drawn-out enchantment. The water spirit sees a human being, and she pulls them under, and that is the end of it. She is not cruel in the stories. She is not vindictive. She is simply herself, and herself is something the human world cannot safely accommodate. She is the river, in the same way that Atargatis was the sea. Not a creature who lives in the water, but a creature who is the water, wearing a face. The face is the trap. That is the consistent message of these Northern European traditions. The face is what makes you forget that the thing behind it is not like you, is not interested in you the way another person would be interested in you, is interested in you the way a current is interested in a fallen leaf. Across the Atlantic, in the traditions of West Africa and the African diaspora, there is a figure of extraordinary power and complexity who has survived the Middle Passage, the catastrophe of slavery, and 4 centuries of cultural suppression to remain one of the most widely venerated water spirits in the world today. Her name is Mami Wata. She is typically depicted as a mermaid, a dark-skinned woman of overwhelming beauty from the waist up, fish or serpent below. Though her iconography is rich and varied and draws from multiple traditions simultaneously, she is associated with water, with wealth, with healing, and with a kind of dangerous, transformative grace. She appears to those she chooses. In dreams, in visions, sometimes, her devotees say, in waking life, and the encounter with her is never neutral. She can bring fortune. She can bring ruin. She demands devotion that is total, and she does not share it willingly. What makes Mami Wata remarkable? What distinguishes her from the Nixie's cold appetite or the siren's mechanical destruction is her full personhood. She is not simply dangerous. She is complicated. She has preferences, moods, a distinct personality, a capacity for both extraordinary generosity and devastating retribution. She is worshipped, not merely feared, across a swath of territory stretching from West Africa through the Caribbean and into South America, wherever the African diaspora carried its spiritual traditions. She has absorbed, over centuries, elements of Hindu goddess imagery, of European mermaid iconography, of indigenous American water spirits, a palimpsest of spiritual traditions layered over one another, forming something that is entirely her own. Her devotees do not think of her as a myth. They think of her as present, as immediate, as someone who might be paying attention right now, in the way that water is always paying attention, moving around everything, remembering the shape of everything it touches. And then there is the Rusalka. In the Slavic tradition, Russian, Ukrainian, Polish, the Rusalka is perhaps the most purely melancholy figure in the entire global mermaid tradition. She is the spirit of a woman who has died by water, drowned in most versions either by misadventure or by her own hand, often in the aftermath of betrayal by a man she loved. She haunts the rivers and lakes where she died. In the spring, she and her sisters emerge onto the land, dancing in meadows at night, their presence making the crops grow, the rains come, the earth fertile. But she is also dangerous, to men especially, and most especially to the men who remind her of what she lost. She can tickle a man to death in the old stories. She can lure him into the water. She can dance him into exhaustion until he collapses. What the Rusalka carries that so many of the other dark mermaid figures do not is grief. A specific, personal, historically grounded grief. She is not the sea's indifference wearing a face. She is a woman who was wronged and who died before she could be right again, and who has not, who cannot, let it go. She is the most human of the dangerous mermaids, and perhaps for that reason, the most haunting. Because her anger is not alien, it is entirely comprehensible. It is the anger of someone who deserved better and did not receive it, amplified by death into something the living world can no longer safely contain. The Rusalka does not hate men because she is a water spirit. She is a water spirit because of what men did. There is a pattern running through all of these traditions, if you step back far enough to see it. The Selkie stolen and kept against her will. The Nixie, who is the river itself, indifferent and absolute. Mamiwata, who demands total devotion and punishes its absence. The Rusalka, drowned by betrayal, returning for something that cannot quite be called justice, but is at least its echo. In every case, the dangerous mermaid is dangerous in ways that have a logic to them. She is not randomly cruel. She is cruel in response to something, to captivity, to intrusion, to abandonment, to the specific and ancient carelessness of the human world toward the things it cannot control or own. The dark mermaid, in other words, is not a monster. She is a consequence. She is what the water becomes when it has been pushed far enough, when the thing that was beautiful and free and belonging to itself has been grabbed at one too many times, by one too many hands that thought beauty was the same thing as availability. The sailors who did not come home from those cold, dark waters. The medieval imagination said a mermaid took them. Perhaps what took them was simpler and older and truer than that. Perhaps what took them was the sea itself, doing what the sea has always done. She just gave it a face. She just made it something you could almost understand. Almost, but not quite. Never quite. That is the point. That has always been the point. Take a breath. We have spent considerable time in the dark, in the grief of the Rusalka, in the cold hunger of the Nixie, in the devastating tenderness of the Selkie's departure. And those are necessary places to visit. They are part of the full truth of this legend. But now we surface. We come up into the light. We turn, for the first time in this documentary, from the world of myth and symbol and human imagination, and we ask a different kind of question. Not, what did people believe, but what is actually down there? And the answer. This is the thing that never quite loses its ability to astonish, no matter how many times you encounter it. The answer is that the ocean is stranger than the myth, richer than the legend, more various, more bewildering, more genuinely alien than anything. The human imagination, working alone, without evidence, has ever managed to conjure. The mermaid is a remarkable creature, but the ocean she was invented to explain is more remarkable still. Let us begin with the animals that most likely started all of this, the biological candidates, as scientists call them, the real creatures of the real sea, whose shapes and behaviors, glimpsed under particular conditions by particular eyes, planted the first seeds of the legend in the human mind. We have already met the manatee, briefly, through Columbus's mildly disappointed journal entry. But the manatee deserves a fuller introduction, because the case for it as the primary biological inspiration for the mermaid tradition is genuinely compelling. There are 3 species of manatee alive in the world today: the West Indian, the Amazonian, and the West African, and together with the dugong of the Indo-Pacific, they form the order Sirenia. That name is not accidental. The scientists who classified them in the 18th and 19th centuries were entirely aware of the connection they were drawing. These are the sirens. These are, in the considered professional opinion of marine biologists, the creatures most responsible for the mermaid myth, as it developed in the ancient Mediterranean, the Caribbean, and the coastal waters of West Africa. And when you spend time with manatees, really spend time with them, in the water, watching them move, you begin to understand why. Not because they look like women. They do not look very much like women at all, and Columbus was right to note his disappointment. But because of how they move, because of the quality of their presence in the water, they are large, up to 13 feet long, weighing as much as a small car. but they move with a slowness and a deliberateness that is almost meditative. They surface without urgency. They breathe with a sigh. They turn and regard you with small, calm, deeply set eyes that hold, if you are in the right frame of mind, a disconcerting suggestion of recognition, of assessment. The females, as noted, nurse their young at the surface, cradling the calf against the chest with their flippers in a posture that the human eye, primed by centuries of cultural expectation, reads immediately as maternal in a human sense, from a boat, at distance, in the particular light of a tropical afternoon, with weeks of open ocean behind you and land still days ahead. You see what you need to see. You see what the story has already told you to look for, and then you write it down, and the log entry joins the long accumulation of sightings, and the legend grows. The dugong is, if anything, an even stronger candidate for the mermaid's origins in the eastern Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. It shares the manatee's general body plan, the rounded head, the flippered forelimbs, the paddle-shaped tail. But it has, additionally, a distinctly bifurcated tail fluke, split like a fish's tail, like a mermaid's tail, as it has been depicted in virtually every artistic tradition that has portrayed her. The dugong was known to ancient Greek and Roman sailors. It inhabited waters they regularly traveled, and unlike the manatee, which tends toward shallow coastal areas, the dugong occasionally appears further offshore, where ships would encounter it under conditions, distance, fatigue, particular light, most conducive to creative misidentification. Then there are the seals and sea lions, the likely source of many of the northern European sightings, including, almost certainly, those reported by Hudson's crew in the Arctic. Pinnipeds, as the broader group is called, have front flippers that can be positioned beneath the body to lift the head and torso clear of the water in a posture that, at distance, resembles a human being treading water with their lower body submerged. Female seals in particular have smooth, rounded faces with large, dark, forward-facing eyes positioned, as all predators' eyes are, for binocular vision, that hold an uncomfortable directness of gaze when they look at you. They look at you the way a person looks at you. That is not a metaphor. It is a straightforward description of what it feels like to be looked at by a seal. And it has been unnerving sailors for as long as sailors have existed. But here is where the story becomes genuinely extraordinary. Because once you move past the surface candidates, the manatees and dugongs and seals, the creatures of the shallow coastal waters, and descend into the actual deep ocean, you find things that require no legend to be astonishing, things that make the mermaids seem, by comparison, almost disappointingly conventional. Consider the oarfish. Rigolecus glessner, to give it its formal name, is the longest bony fish in the ocean, capable of reaching lengths of over 50 feet. It is silver, almost mirror-like, with a dramatic red dorsal fin running the full length of its body, and a crest of elongated red fin rays rising from its head like a crown. It is almost never seen alive. It lives in the mesopelagic zone, the twilight zone of the ocean, between 600 and 3,000 feet down, and it surfaces only rarely, usually when it is dying, washing up on beaches or drifting at the surface, in a state of terminal confusion that observers throughout history have described as sea serpent sightings. It is a real animal. It is alive in the ocean right now, and it looks, if you encounter it at the surface from a small wooden boat without the benefit of a marine biology degree, like something out of a nightmare or a myth. Consider the giant squid, Archaetuthus ducks. For most of human history, this creature was a legend, the kraken of Scandinavian mythology, the many-armed terror of the deep that could drag a ship under. Scientists knew it existed because they found its beaks in the stomachs of sperm whales and its tentacle sucker scars on the skin of those same whales. But a live adult giant squid in its natural habitat was not photographed until 2004, not filmed in motion until 2012. A creature the length of a school bus, with eyes the size of dinner plates, the largest eyes of any animal on Earth, evolved specifically to see in the near-total darkness of the deep ocean, had managed to remain, for the entire span of recorded human history, essentially invisible. The ocean kept that secret for a very long time. It keeps others still. In 2013, a television channel that had built its reputation on nature documentaries aired a program called Mermaids, The Body Found. It presented itself as a documentary. It featured actors playing scientists. It included fabricated footage, fabricated sonar readings, and fabricated government cover-up narratives. It claimed, with the full aesthetic apparatus of a legitimate nature documentary, the serious voiceover, the scientific graphics, the interviews with grave-faced researchers, that the United States government had discovered evidence of real mermaids and was suppressing the information. It was fiction, clearly labeled as such in the small print, in the way that small print tends to be, technically present and practically invisible. Millions of people believed it. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, the American government agency responsible for the study of the oceans, was compelled to issue an official public statement clarifying that no evidence of aquatic humanoids had ever been found. They had never, in the history of that organization, issued such a statement before, because they had never before needed to. The volume of genuine public inquiry following that documentary was sufficient to require an official government response. This is a remarkable thing when you sit with it, not as evidence of mass credulity. The documentary was well made, and the desire to believe is a powerful cognitive force, and there is no shame in the fact that people wanted it to be true, but as evidence of something more durable than that, something more interesting. Even in 2013, in a world of satellite imaging and deep-sea submersibles and DNA databases and every tool of modern science that the ancient Assyrians and medieval sailors and exhausted Caribbean navigators did not have. Even then, the idea of the mermaid retained enough power to move people, to make them call a government agency and ask. She still had that much pull, and why would she not? Because the deep ocean, even now, is genuinely unknown in ways that the surface world is not. More than 80% of it remains unmapped, unobserved, unexplored in any detail. The number of species estimated to live in the ocean's depths runs into the hundreds of thousands, of which science has formally described only a fraction. New species are discovered regularly, named, filed, and promptly overshadowed by the next discovery. Some of them are beautiful beyond description. Some of them are so strange that no mythology, working without evidence, would have had the imaginative audacity to invent them. The barrel-eye fish, transparent-headed, with tubular eyes that rotate within its skull to track bioluminescent prey in the dark. The anglerfish, with its terrible lamp of living light dangling above its enormous jaws, luring the curious toward something they will not survive. The siphonophore, not a single animal but a colony of specialized organisms acting in coordinated concert, extending through the water in forms that can reach over 150 feet in length, making them potentially the longest animals alive, invisible for most of human history, present in every ocean on Earth. These are real. They are here now, in the water, going about their ancient business. The mermaid, perhaps, was never the point. The mermaid was the question human beings have been asking, in one form or another, for as long as they have stood at the edge of the water and looked out at the place where the horizon swallows the sea. What is down there? And the ocean, as always, keeps most of its answer to itself. That is not a frustration. That is an invitation. That is the oldest invitation in the world. Every legend that survives long enough eventually stops being about the thing it was named for. The dragon stopped being about dragons. The giant stopped being about giants, and the mermaid, after 4,000 years of temples and ship's logs and cathedral carvings and government press releases, the mermaid stopped being about a creature with a fishtail a very long time ago. She was always about something else. She was always, underneath the scales and the singing and the dangerous beauty, about the same thing she has always been about: the boundary, that line where the known world ends and the unknown begins, where the land, solid, mapped, named, manageable, gives way to something that will not be mapped or named or managed, where the human story, with all its comforting structures and familiar faces, reaches its edge. She lives there, the mermaid. She has always lived exactly there. And the reason she has never left, the reason no century has successfully retired her, the reason she still compels us in an age of sonar and satellites and submersibles, is that the boundary has never moved. It is still there. It will always be there. Think of what she has absorbed across the centuries. Every anxiety a civilization carried toward the water, she held it. Every longing for the unreachable, every grief for what the sea took, every unsettling suspicion that the universe is larger and stranger than human understanding can comfortably accommodate. She held all of it. She was the vessel into which the ocean's meaning was poured, generation after generation, culture after culture, each one finding in her exactly what they needed to find. The ancient Babylonians found in her the origin of wisdom, the knowledge that comes from depth, from darkness, from the places ordinary life cannot reach. The medieval church found in her the seduction of the mortal world, beauty as a force that pulls the soul downward when it should be reaching up. The sailors found in her an explanation for loss, for the ships that went out and did not return, for the men who loved the sea and were taken by it, for the fundamental unfairness of an ocean that gives no reasons. The coastal communities of West Africa found in her a deity worthy of devotion, powerful, demanding, generous when honored, terrible when wronged. And we, in the modern world, find in her something that all of those things, perhaps, were pointing toward all along. We find in her the part of ourselves that does not fit, the part that belongs to something larger than the life we have built on dry land, the part that hears the water and feels, beneath the ordinary texture of a weekday, an old and wordless pull toward something it cannot name. She is not outside us. She never was. The mermaid endures because longing endures, because the human condition includes, as one of its most defining features, the persistent sense that there is a world beyond the one we inhabit, more beautiful, more free, more fully alive, and that it is always just beyond reach, just below the surface, just past the place where our feet can still touch the bottom. Every culture that dreamed her was dreaming about that, about the life that exists at the edge of the possible, about the self that could exist if the constraints of the surface world, the obligations, the limitations, the relentless gravity of the ordinary, simply fell away. She is what we imagine we might become if we were brave enough, or desperate enough, or loved enough to follow something all the way down into the dark. That is why she sings. The song is not a trap. At the deepest level of the legend, the song is a description. It is the sound of the other life, the parallel life, the life that runs beneath this one like an underwater current, cold and clear and going somewhere the surface cannot follow. She has been singing it for 4,000 years. The ocean has not changed. The human heart has not changed. And so she has not changed. She has adapted her appearance, the red hair, the green tail, the merchandised image on 1,000 children's lunchboxes. But underneath the adaptation, she remains what she always was, the face at the threshold, the figure who stands exactly where the safe world ends and holds out her hand and does not tell you where she is going, only that it is down, only that it is deep, only that the ones who follow do not tend to come back the same. Whether that is a warning or a promise has always depended on who is doing the listening. Perhaps it has always been both. The water is dark tonight and very still. Somewhere below the surface, below the reach of the light, below the noise of the world above, something moves, slowly, without urgency, with the particular patience of a thing that has been waiting long enough to know that waiting is not the same as losing. She is not a myth. She is a question the ocean has been asking since before the first human being stood at its edge and looked out and felt, in the cavity of the chest, that specific and irreplaceable feeling, equal parts terror and longing, that has no other name. She will be asking it long after the last ship has gone home. Listen, there is a particular kind of subject that does something unusual to artists. Not all subjects do this. Most subjects, a bowl of fruit, a country landscape, a portrait of a dignitary in formal dress. Ask the artist to look outward, to observe, to record, to render faithfully what the eye can see and the hand can follow. These are noble tasks. They have produced some of the greatest works in human history, but they are, at their core, exercises in attention, in careful, disciplined looking. The mermaid asks for something different. She asks the artist to look inward, because she cannot be observed. She cannot be posed or lit or measured. She exists only in the imagination, which means that every artist who has ever painted her, sculpted her, written her, or sung about her has been doing something that goes beyond craft. They have been revealing something about longing, about beauty, about the particular shape of the human hunger for a world that does not exist and cannot be reached. And for that reason, the art the mermaid has inspired across 4,000 years of human creativity is unlike almost any other body of work in the history of aesthetics. It is a record not of what the world looks like, but of what we wish it contained. Begin, as we so often must, with the ancient world. Because the visual tradition of the mermaid is nearly as old as the written one, and in some ways more revealing. The earliest depictions of a targetus that have survived into the present are not paintings. They are coins. Small, worn, extraordinarily durable coins from the ancient Near East, stamped with the image of a goddess from the waist up, a fish from the waist down, her arms often extended, her expression composed and authoritative. These are not romantic images. They were not designed to be beautiful in any decorative sense. They were designed to convey power, the compact, unmistakable power of a deity rendered in a medium designed to travel, to pass from hand to hand across the ancient world, carrying its image wherever commerce carried it. The mermaid, in other words, began her artistic life as currency, as something people traded, something of established and agreed upon value. That is not an accident. It tells us something about how the ancient world understood her, not as a fantasy, but as a fact of the cosmos. A figure whose existence was as reliable as the market rate for grain. From the coins of the ancient Near East, her image moved into the mosaic tradition of the Greco-Roman world. And here, something shifts. The mosaics of Pompeii and Herculaneum, preserved by the catastrophe that destroyed everything else, show marine creatures of all kinds, and among them, regularly, figures that are half human and half fish, moving through a rendered ocean with the easy confidence of things that belong there. These are not frightening figures. They are decorative ones, in the best sense of the word. They are part of a visual vocabulary of abundance, of the richness of the natural world, of the sea as a place of wonder rather than terror. The Romans who walked across these floors every day were not being warned. They were being delighted. This tension, the mermaid as warning versus the mermaid as delight, would define her artistic history for the next 2,000 years. In the medieval period, as we have already noted, the mermaid entered the visual language of the church, carved into stone, illuminated on vellum, worked into the decorative programs of buildings designed to last forever. And the medieval artist's mermaid is a genuinely strange and fascinating creature. She is beautiful, usually, in that flat, stylized, pre-perspective way that medieval art renders all beauty. More symbolic than sensual, more iconic than individual. She holds her mirror and her comb with the same serene detachment with which the Madonna holds the Christ child. She is not depicted in motion. She is not depicted in distress or desire. She simply is, fixed in her symbolic meaning, as permanent and declarative as a heraldic device. And heraldry is, in fact, one of the places where the mermaid exercised her greatest and most lasting visual influence. She appears on hundreds of coats of arms across Europe, in England, in Scotland, in France and Germany and the Netherlands. She was a popular heraldic charge, chosen by families and cities and institutions that wished to convey something specific, maritime power, perhaps, or beauty combined with danger, or simply the connection to the sea that defines so much of European wealth and identity. The city of Warsaw carries a mermaid on its coat of arms to this day, a sword-bearing, shield-carrying warrior mermaid known as the Syrenka, who is not a figure of romance but of fierce municipal pride. She has defended her city in the symbolic language of heraldry for centuries. The mermaid, in other words, was not only beautiful, she was useful. She was a symbol that could be deployed, that carried meaning efficiently and elegantly, that communicated something about the entity that bore her image. She was as versatile in the hands of the medieval visual imagination as she was ancient. Then came the Renaissance, and with it a transformation in how the mermaid was seen and painted that is perhaps the most significant shift in her entire artistic history. The Renaissance brought perspective. It brought the nude. It brought the idea that the human body, particularly the female human body, was a subject worthy of the most serious and sustained artistic attention, an embodiment of divine proportion and earthly beauty simultaneously. And into this new visual landscape, the mermaid arrived like something that had been waiting for precisely this moment, because now she could be rendered not as a symbol, but as a body, as a presence, as something with weight and dimension and the particular quality of light on wet skin. The Renaissance artist could look at a mermaid and apply to her the same careful, devoted, technically ambitious attention they gave to Venus rising from the sea. And in many ways, the two figures merged. The mermaid and the goddess of love occupied the same visual territory in the Renaissance imagination. Both were born of water. Both were beautiful beyond the ordinary. Both were associated with a kind of desire that exceeded the safely domestic and reached toward something more elemental, more dangerous, more ancient than any particular human attachment. Sandro Botticelli's Venus, rising from her shell on the surface of the sea, her long hair moving in a wind that seems to come from a different atmosphere than the one we breathe. She is not a mermaid, technically, but she inhabits the same imaginative space. She is what the Renaissance made of the boundary between the human world and the one beneath the water. She is the sea's gift to the land, the meeting of two worlds in a body of impossible beauty, arriving on the shore with the same quality of impossible arrival that the mermaid had always possessed. But it is the 19th century that gave us the mermaid we carry most immediately in our minds. The 19th century, and two things that arrived in it almost simultaneously and transformed the creature entirely. The first was Romanticism, that great cultural movement which turned its face away from the rational, the ordered, the Enlightenment confidence in human reason, and toward the wild, the emotional, the supernatural, the past. The romantics loved the mermaid with a particular and somewhat desperate intensity, because she represented everything they felt the modern world was destroying. She was nature, unconstrained. She was feeling without apology. She was the ancient world, still alive in the water, still singing in a language that the industrial age could not translate and the factory chimney could not reach. The painters of the Romantic and later pre-Raphaelite movements produced some of the most enduring mermaid imagery in the history of art. John William Waterhouse, the English painter working at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, returned to the subject again and again with an almost obsessive devotion. His mermaids are not symbolic, they are not heraldic, they are not theological, they are psychological. They sit on rocks in attitudes of complete self-possession, examining themselves in mirrors, combing their hair with the unhurried ease of creatures who exist entirely outside the social obligations of the world above the water. They do not look at the viewer with imputation. They look, when they look at all, with a cool assessment that contains within it no particular interest in being assessed in return. These are among the most honest depictions of the mermaid in the entire artistic tradition, because they restore to her something that the romance of earlier centuries had gradually stripped away: her fundamental separateness, her not quite humanness, the quality of being a thing that can be looked at but not known, observed but not possessed. Waterhouse's mermaids are beautiful, yes, but they are beautiful the way the sea is beautiful, indifferently, without concern for your response, without any intention of comfort. The second thing the 19th century gave the mermaid was Hans Christian Andersen. In 1837, the Danish writer published a story called Den Lille Havfru, The Little Mermaid, and, in doing so, performed an act of cultural transformation so complete that it is difficult now to see past it to the older tradition behind it. Andersen's mermaid is a creature of pure longing. She does not want to pull sailors under. She does not demand devotion. She does not carry a sword or hold a mirror with cool self-regard. She wants legs. She wants a soul. She wants to be human, and she is willing to pay a price for it. That is, in the original story, not the Disney adaptation, but the original, almost unbearably steep. She gives up her voice. She walks on legs that feel like knives with every step. She does not get the prince, and at the end, she does not die in the way that the Disney version carefully forecloses. She dissolves into sea foam, becoming, in Andersen's telling, a spirit of the air who must earn her soul through centuries of invisible good works. It is a devastating story. It is also, if you hold it up against the full 4,000-year tradition we have been tracing, a radical reversal of everything the mermaid originally represented. The original mermaid did not want to be human. She was greater than human. She was the sea itself, wearing a face. The idea that she might look up at the dry land and ache to belong there, that she might trade her power and her element and her voice for a pair of legs and an unrequited love, would have been, to the ancient Assyrians who first worshipped Atargates, not touching but incomprehensible. And yet the Andersen mermaid endured. She endured because she gave voice to something the older tradition had not quite articulated. The specific grief of the creature caught between worlds who belongs fully to neither. The one who can see both shores and reach neither. She made the mermaid's threshold not a position of power, but a position of longing, and in doing so, she made her human in the deepest sense, not in her anatomy, in her ache. Every artist who has touched the mermaid since Andersen has had to reckon with what he did to her, has had to decide, consciously or not, whether to restore her power or honor her longing, whether to give her back her mirror and her cool self-possession, or to leave her standing in the shallows, looking toward a shore she can almost, but not quite, reach. Most, it must be said, have chosen the longing, because the longing, in the end, is the part that feels most like us. Every story, if it is told long enough, becomes something more than a story. It becomes a way of thinking, a groove worn into the mind by centuries of repetition, deep enough that thoughts flow into it naturally, without effort, the way water finds the lowest channel and follows it without being asked. The mermaid is one of those grooves. She has been worn into the human imagination so deeply over so long that she shapes the way we think about things that have nothing to do with the sea, about beauty and danger, about the wild and the domestic, about the parts of ourselves we cannot show in polite company, and the parts of the world we cannot reduce to something manageable. She became, across the 20th century, a presence in places no ancient Assyrian priest and no medieval theologian would have predicted. She surfaced in the modernist poetry of Eliot and Yeats, not as fantasy but as metaphor for the unreachable. Eliot's Prufrock, that paralyzed, self-doubting everyman of the modern age, hearing the mermaids singing, each to each, and knowing, with a sadness that contains the whole of the modern condition within it, that they do not sing to him. She appeared in wartime, their image painted on the noses of aircraft by young men who were flying towards something they might not return from, carrying her the way sailors had always carried her. As a talisman against the void, as beauty pressed against the face of danger. She moved through the century quietly but persistently, appearing wherever human beings found themselves confronting the same ancient confrontation. The edge of the known, the beginning of the dark, the question that has no answer. And then the 21st century arrived and something unexpected happened. She came back. Not quietly this time, not as metaphor or talisman or theological puzzle. She came back as herself, in literature, in film, in the visual culture of the internet, in the communities of people who call themselves mermaids and spend their weekends in swimming pools and open water with custom-built silicone tails, moving through the blue with a grace that is, whatever else you wish to say about it, entirely genuine. She came back in the conversations of marine biologists who speak about the ocean's endangered ecosystems with the same protective passion that the old stories gave to those who had offended a water spirit. She came back in the way that things come back when they were never truly gone. Not as a revival, but as a surfacing, as something that had been there all along, beneath the noise of the century, waiting for the water to go still enough that it could be seen again. What does it mean that she returned at precisely the moment when the ocean itself is most in peril? When the coral bleaches and the ice retreats and the deep water warms in ways it has not warmed in human memory? Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. Perhaps the mermaid has always been most visible when the sea most needs a voice, when the boundary she inhabits is under pressure, when the wild and unmappable thing she represents is being reduced, diminished, brought closer to extinction than any legend should have to witness. She was the sea given a face. And the sea, right now, is asking to be seen. So here we are, at the end of the documentary, and the end of the long tide of the telling. 4,000 years. Every ocean, every culture that ever built a boat, or stood at the edge of the water and looked out, and felt that pull, that wordless, ancient, specifically human pull, toward the deep and the unknown, and the beautiful, and the dangerous. She was in all of it. She held all of it. She is holding it still. She is not a myth in the end. A myth is something that was believed and then was not. She is something older and more durable than that. She is a truth that the human mind keeps arriving at independently, across every distance of time and culture and geography, because the truth she carries does not age and does not diminish, and does not become less true with the passage of centuries. The boundary is real. The longing is real. The deep water is real, and it is largely unknown, and it is magnificent, and it will outlast us. She will be here when we are gone, still at the threshold, still singing. The water is calm tonight. Listen,